What is going on, football fans? SECfans.com. Here we are, postseason. Got a lot of football to talk about. Going to start out with the big one, Alabama and Washington, but we're going to cover a lot of other games in the SEC. We've got computer models for, I think, all of them. Husky can chime in a minute and correct me if I'm wrong, but speaking of which, we've got Husky in the house, of course, every show. Somebody's got to bolster my nerdiness because I can only carry so much nerd and so much data talk on the show. So he comes in to help me out. So first up, Alabama, Washington. We're going to get into this in detail, and we're going to get into a computer model, and maybe some of you who don't know or don't normally see us, we do get nerdy in that way. But before we do that, I just want to talk about this game from a high-level standpoint, and hopefully we've got some Washington fans listening. For those of you who don't know or haven't seen us throughout the year, we've been pretty high on Washington. Starting out, I think we've predicted every Washington game correctly this year, especially the ones that mattered. And we were on the Washington bandwagon pretty early. And what we said was, of all the teams that Alabama could potentially face, or an SEC team, but namely Alabama, could potentially face in the postseason, Washington was one that was poised to give them some trouble, especially because of the accuracy of Jake Browning. So I want to open this segment with a question to you, Husky Pup, in that when we were saying those things, it was early, middle of the season. We were really impressed with Jake Browning. He saw a little bit of a struggle against USC, Utah to a certain extent, and Colorado. So some of those better teams with better defensive fronts. Has your perception about Jake Browning or Washington in general changed, stayed the same, better or worse? Tell me what you think in relations to their ability to give Bama some trouble.
My opinion on Jake Browning has definitely changed over the course of the season, which I think is sort of natural when you consider the trajectory that their season has taken, right? They started very strong, averaging about 50 points a game early in the season. And really, they were borderline unflappable. I mean, there was nothing that was really challenging them. There was nothing that was slowing them down. Uh, and really through the Oregon State game, especially during the Stanford game, you felt like they were a complete team. They were dominant. I know the two of us talked about it quite a bit, that Jake Browning had a very good ability to find the open man, deliver the football efficiently and effectively. They look like a team that had everything clicking. We said as of week 3 in the season that we thought Washington would be in the playoff. As of week 3, this is, by the way, when Louisville was still undefeated, Stanford was still undefeated. They were about to play Washington. I thought that the playoff was going to be Alabama, Clemson, Washington, and Michigan. I ended up being right about Washington, which seemed like a poll. It seemed I was right about Clemson, which seems obvious now, but at the time, Louisville was by far the hotter team. I was wrong about Michigan. It ended up being Ohio State. I thought Michigan was going to be too much for Ohio State to handle in the trenches. I will say in my defense, I think Michigan was too much for Ohio State to handle in the trenches. Michigan, outgained Ohio State and everything in a per play sense. It's just Michigan managed to screw up at the end of that ball game and lose a game they probably should not have lost. But regardless, we were very high on Washington. The problem was the Pac 12 does not have very many teams this year that have good offensive lines and good defensive lines at the same time. Stanford is way down. I don't think Stanford's a very good team. I'm still baffled that Southern Cal lost to Stanford. Maybe that's the Alabama hangover, for Washington fans that may be listening. Something you probably haven't experienced is that something like 85% of teams that play Alabama fail to cover the following week. They get just too beat up physically. But at the end of the day, there just aren't a lot of physical fronts. And when they played better teams, be it Utah, be it Southern Cal, even Colorado in that blowout win later in the season, I felt like they struggled significantly. And a lot of it, I think, was due to the fact that the offensive line didn't hold up very well. The fact that they couldn't just use a power run game, which is at this point almost unique in the Pac 12, as strange as that is, to overwhelm their opponents. And, all of a sudden they struggled. So that really did change my perception of who Washington is as a team, and the dominant team I saw early in the year seems to have a lot more chinks in the armor now.
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, we've seen every game Washington's played this year. So I know a lot of people on the West Coast they do sometimes have a beef in terms of East Coast bias. In this case, I don't think it's the case because Washington jumped out with such a lead on the Pac-12 so early. They were playing a lot of primetime games, and they were playing a lot of we're not talking about like obscure Pac-12 network type games. We're talking about either ESPN or Fox games that not only did we see, when they happened, but we've also gone back and watched these games in detail just to see, educate ourselves so we can, speak to this game beyond just what the stats say. And so what I want to talk about in this game are a little bit on matchups first, and something you and I both noticed with Washington in regards to something that I found pretty surprising. They had some struggles with Southern Cal and their physicality on both sides of the line, but it didn't seem to bother them as much in any other game in the Pac-12. And when I watch Washington play, I notice they play really small, especially on the defensive line. I know they have some actual, weight there in the middle of the defensive line, but in terms of, big front seven players that we're used to seeing in the SEC, big fast edge rushers, they're not there in terms of size. So explain a little bit in terms of how Washington was able to sort of play around that maybe deficiency. Is it because of the schemes in the Pac-12, the type of personnel in the Pac-12, and is it either going to play to their advantage against an SEC team that may not be able to handle the speed or whatever, how they do their spacings on their defensive line, or is it something that's going to be to their detriment when they face an Alabama?
I definitely think that Washington's done a lot of things to sort of address what deficiencies they have and lean on their strengths. They have a good running back. I think they have a fairly athletic line, if it's not overly powerful. They have a very good quarterback. They have two very good receivers. Defensively, which is more of the crux of your question, Washington has good size in the middle, right? Gaines and Qualls are big defensive linemen. I think Vita Vey, a defensive end's big, and he's also a pretty powerful guy. Now, all three of them are, moderately young on the grand scheme of things. I think Gaines and Qualls may be NFL linemen. Um, and no offense to Washington fans out there, but you have to understand in the SEC, having a quote unquote NFL defensive tackle isn't necessarily novel in the Southeastern Conference. It is sort of the thing that defines the SEC. And every team, including Mississippi State, has defensive linemen. The question is, do you have first round picks and second round picks, or fifth, sixth, and seventh guys? And if you don't have NFL linemen in the SEC, you usually tend to get run over, which has happened to Mississippi State this year in their defensive implosion. But regardless, what they're hiding is the fact that they have 220-pound linebackers. And when they lost Victor to injury at linebacker, now they have a size issue, they have a tackling issue, and the secondary is very good. Buda Baker at safety, McIntosh at safety, great ball hawks, but the problem there is these guys are small. I mean, Buda Baker's 180 pounds, 5'10". That wouldn't probably cut it at safety in the SEC just because you're asked to play up and run support more. Now the corners, King and Jones are phenomenal, and they both get a ton of credit. King gets a tremendous amount of credit as a high profile player, and you're talking about all conference and all American players at this level. But even Jones kind of gets overshadowed. Guys hardly even throw the ball at Jones. What the problem is with all of them is you got one guy that's over 200 pounds, at McIntosh at safety, and he's about 209. And the rest of them are all 180, 190. King's really tall, so even though he's 190, he's not necessarily that big in terms of frame. They're just not that big. They're designed to play 5 wide sets and 4 wide sets, which you see constantly in the Pac-12. They can really stymie you with the inside run game. And when you're running those 4 wide sets, what you have is you tend to have like a zone read concept. You either run the ball up the middle, you're going to try to string it out wide, which means you need big guys in the middle to plug it, which they have. You need speed at linebacker to run it down if they try to go wide, which they have. And you need a lot of basically corners playing safety on the outside to be able to contain in coverage, which again, they have. What they don't really have is size at safety and the size at linebacker to deal with a team that's going to use the power run on the edges. And that's something Alabama will do. In previous years, I think Stanford and a lot of other teams, as I said earlier, play that style of football, but this year they don't. And I'm really curious to see if Washington can deal with a team that is going to be willing to just pound it at them, because I think Joe Williams had a lot of success in the second half running the football right at him. And I don't really know that there has been anyone in the pack, frankly, including USC, that is going to present the sort of threat that Alabama is going to pose.
And on that point, let me jump in real quick because you're on USC, and I want to ask you because it's related to this. Sorry to interrupt, but Ronald Jones in that game against Washington for Southern Cal, 23 carries, 93 yards, 4 yards a carry. I would argue that that's a pretty respectable defensive outing against what you and I both think, or who you and I think both think is a really good running back. Do you think that's fair?
I do think that's fair. Ronald Jones is a good back. USC's line struggles with penetration. They're too big. They can't deal with guys getting inside. I think Alabama had two or three guys in the backfield every play, but they are big and they are powerful and they can move a lot of teams off the ball. They were able to do that throughout the second half of the season. I do caution a little bit though that as good as Ronald Jones is, again, their offensive line just isn't really complete. They struggled way too much against Alabama. I mean, they graded out very, very poorly. Alabama had two or three guys in the backfield every play. I don't mean that facetiously or hyperbolically. They really did have two guys in the backfield every play. So I'm not sure how much I want to take from
And
that ball
Washington
game.
fans, don't get upset. We do our fair share of beating up the SEC too. We're not complete homers. We really, what we really try to do here is be honest to what the data shows us and what we see on the field. And what that turns out being sometimes is that we have a little bit of a what is perceived as a critical eye, or that we're just seriously talking trash about someone's team, and that's not the case. We just try to be honest with what we see, and where we point out weaknesses, we will also point out strengths. And leading into that, I think the real strength of this defense, even though we've seen them do pretty well in the run game and we've seen them do pretty well, obviously, in just pure scoring defense, is Washington's secondary. And everybody knows about Buda Baker, but they've also got some real talent with a guy like Sidney Jones or, from their cornerbacks. So I wonder if, just to give Alabama fans a little bit of a comparison, is Florida a fair comparison in terms of really good secondary play, potential NFL talent, and the kind of ability that a Jalen Hurts is going to see in the secondary? And follow-up question, is there an opportunity here, because we've noted in the past that Jalen can struggle in the passing game? Is there an opportunity here, because their secondary is so good, to really impact Alabama's ability to move the ball?
I think their secondary does compare favorably to someone like Florida. I think their corners are probably just as good in pass coverage. And for those in the West Coast that maybe are unaware, Florida's corners and Tabor and Wilson, those are potentially both first round draft picks. So this is high praise to say that they're on par with Florida. I think in some ways Washington's safeties are better in coverage and probably maybe even substantially worse in run defense. Again, not a slight. I'm sorry. Buda Baker is really a corner playing safety. At 5'10", 180, I just can't see him playing safety effectively at the next level. He's too small. There's certain things you can do with him as a nickelback or a rover, but the thing that really differentiates Washington, as good as they are as a ball hawking team, and as much as, to answer your second question, I do think they have a lot of potential to create turnovers and to intercept the ball if Alabama's aggressive. The problem is, are they big enough to hold up in the run game to force Alabama to throw in the first place? Now, Lane Kiffin likes to throw the ball when he absolutely shouldn't. He's done that a lot, and He's pretty stubbornly set on using the pass to set up the run. Where we discussed in the Auburn game that they really needed to use the run to set up the pass. The Florida game as well, and he was unwilling to do that, which was it was kind of an interesting thing to watch because it seemed kind of foolish. But they don't have a Jamal Adams at Washington. So the secondary can make a big impact in the passing game. My concern is I don't know that they're going to make that big an impact in the run game. And again, kind of harping on this, but the real concern is Washington hasn't faced a team that's made the secondary really try to play in the run game. Southern Cal did to some degree, and Southern Cal was somewhat capable. And then Utah had a lot of success, and those are really the only two teams that are capable of doing it. So that's my real concern.
Yeah, and I guess talk about that for a minute because you mentioned how some of these pieces are somewhat interchangeable, and for Washington fans who maybe haven't followed Alabama as much, they've got a corner in Minka Fitzpatrick playing safety currently to fill in for an injured Eddie Jackson, and he's been sort of one of those interchangeable pieces. I know Saban has employed some other players like Mo Smith in the past who have done that a little bit too. So talk about a little bit the liabilities that you can have when you play these safeties who are really primary coverage guys and not necessarily built to support the run or match up against a tight end. Is it a huge liability, or have schemes gone so advanced that they can kind of cover some of that and really prioritize, the passing game?
Well, again, I think when you have these interchangeable parts, it works really well when you play teams that are multiple. Um, a lot of the teams in the Pac-12 like to line up in three wide sets or four wide sets or five wide sets, and they go zone read and they motion guys around a lot. And having a lot of coverage safeties is a huge boon when you're playing that type of offense because it gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility. Booter Baker gets lined up in man coverage all the time. You don't have to worry about him. He's not a liability. He's a coverage player. The problem is, and it's what Washington doesn't see. Can you go the other way? When the other team wants to go max protect and put a fullback on the field, do you have the ability to stop that? And lately in the Big 12 and the Pac-12, we haven't seen that style of football. And at times, I think it's been a serious liability for both conferences and bowl games because obviously you build your team to defend in conference play. You don't build them to win in the bowls, at least not until you're operating a very high level. Washington's still rebuilding. They're a young team. They're using the pieces they have, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Peterson. I mean, he's using these pieces to great effect, but they are, like you said, sort of interchangeable parts. I'm not really sure they're built to be in the roles that they're in. Peterson's found a way to get his best players in the field, and as it turns out, he basically has three corners and a safety in a base set. So, the question is when they go up against Alabama, is Alabama just choose to stay in three wide sets? If they do, how much are they going to be asked to help in run support? Alabama does a lot of sort of power plays to the outside, and what you're going to see is Alabama's going to use a QB power to the outside, and Buda Baker is going to have to fill that outside lane, right? He's going to be responsible for the quarterback. Well, what happens when Buda Baker tries to fill the lane? Normally, if it's Alabama or LSU, you got Jamal Adams coming on a running back. He's going to stand that guy up and win that battle more often than not, even against a tight end in run support. But, Alabama has a 240-pound tailback, Bo Scarborough, that really came on the last two games of the season, and we expect to see a lot of in this bowl game. I don't know how a 180-pound Buda Baker is going to stand up against a 240-pound running back. I don't understand how Washington's 220-pound linebackers are going to stand up against a 240-pound running back. And if Bo Scarborough can blow those guys back, and especially if he can get to the second guy, then you're going to have a very capable runner in Jalen Hurts going downfield. And again, they have to be able to stop that play before they're able to leverage their coverage skills when Alabama's forced to pass. Because if they don't, Alabama is going to run and only throw when necessary, again, in theory, and that's going to really limit the effectiveness of Washington's defense as a whole.
So, and I promise Bama fans, SEC fans, we will transition to Alabama, but y'all know what you got in Alabama. So we want to give you a little taste of what we've seen from Washington and kind of how where these matchups are, because that's honestly the interesting the interesting part of this game. So switching to offense for Washington for a minute, we all know Jake Browning's really, really, really good. We saw him struggle a little bit when the line play broke down, and I'm going to have you touch on that in a second. But talk about these wide receivers. I know, in my opinion, I think Ross. Everybody knows Ross is really good. He's All American caliber wide receiver, and we all saw what he did to Adore Jackson on that ankle breaking touchdown. But on the other side, Pettis, I think, is a really solid wide receiver. And, as we saw against Utah, he's a great kick returner as well. So talk a little bit about how these two players match up against the Alabama secondary. And the question I guess I have in that is, can Washington's offensive line hold up well enough to give Browning time? And does it matter? Does he have enough escapability and enough improbability that he can create without having a clean pocket, and they can do some things offensively from a scheme standpoint to neutralize that advantage that Alabama might have to really put some points up on the board?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure we fully know the answer. I mean, Browning is pretty athletic, and he's been able to move around in the pocket, and that's let him leverage what I think are excellent receivers, right? And Ross and Pettis. I mean, they're as good as probably a tandem as Alabama has seen all year, and guys like that give Alabama a lot of trouble. And you can rag Alabama all you want, but Alabama uses a lot of man coverage schemes. When you do that, corners are an island, just like the NFL. Uh, a perfectly thrown ball to an elite receiver is not a good thing. You need safety help. The second half of the season, the safeties really stepped up, but it's pretty unclear really where Alabama's at in terms of a coverage secondary, just because they've had so many injuries. Like you said, something to take into account with the Florida game. Even remember is that Alabama was out a starting corner, Marlon Humphrey, and when I say starting corner, I mean possible top 15 draft pick, and they ended up starting a walk on at corner. So yeah, Florida had some success throwing the ball, but that's a little odd. But even still, it's not really clear how much the loss of Eddie Jackson's going to hurt them, because neither Auburn nor Florida was really obviously a very good passing offense. Stepping back a little bit, the problem with Washington watching Colorado, Utah, and the Southern Cal game is that their offensive line gives up a lot of disruption. Now, something that struck me, when I was watching those games, and particularly the Utah game, is Utah would be constantly in the backfield, but they didn't have the athleticism to really run down Browning. Browning is a plus athlete in the traditional sense for a quarterback, but he's he's not Jalen Hurts. He's not going to outrun a high level linebacker. But when you watch Colorado's linebackers are slow. I mean, just slow. And Browning could roll the pocket, get to the edge, and throw the ball where he wanted. Against Southern Cal, you couldn't do that nearly as much, and you could tell. But even Southern Cal wasn't that fast. So it is fair to say when people talk about the defensive line, I'm not so concerned about them blowing up. I mean, I am concerned about the fact that can Washington run the ball, but it's the fact that when Browning gets out of the pocket, Alabama's linebackers are going to be able to close at a rate that they've never seen. And I'm not trying to be snarky or what have you. It's just right now Alabama isn't that like 2004, 2005 USC mold, if they remember. There's a lot of Clay Matthews guys running around for Alabama right now. Rashawn Evans, one of the middle linebackers, come playing for Sean Deion Hamilton, who's injured. Yeah, their backup that's playing injured is a 5-star junior, 5-star recruit as a junior, and he probably runs something like a 4.5 40, a true 4.5 40, I should note, and he's a middle linebacker, an absolute freak athlete, and he will run down Browning in a heartbeat. So I'm not sure how well that's going to go, because he's not going to really be able to scramble. He will be forced to stay in the pocket. And I think you're going to know the answer to a lot of this very quickly. And it's really going to hinge on if Washington can run it. If Washington can run the ball and keep things honest and keep the linebackers watching gap assignments and keep Alabama, sort of playing to the line of scrimmage, then they can move Browning around a little bit and throw it. If they can't run the ball and Alabama can really focus on the pass rush, and their linebackers can either drop in coverage or blitz the passer and not have to worry about gap integrity, it's going to be really, really tough for Browning to distribute the football the way that I think he's capable of doing, but may just not have the time.
I wonder, and this is sort of my segue into Alabama, kind of bridging the gap with both teams. Washington has a tendency to start off really fast. Like, if you notice the games like Washington State and a few others, they jump out early, and it's I think it's an injustice to Washington to say that they hold on to win the game, just because the scoring doesn't keep pace with what happens early on. That just is part of the style of what they play, and maybe it's part of the scheme and how teams adjust to them. But talk about how, is there a concern here for Alabama fans, given their penchant, Alabama's penchant, to start really, really slow? I mean, like, historically slow, versus Washington's, uncanny ability to. It seems like they put up 14 every first quarter. Talk about that a little bit. It doesn't matter. Is every game its own thing, or is this a bit of potential concern for Alabama fans?
I think it is a concern, and it's something I touched on earlier. Lane Kiffin does use the pass to set up the run. I think he does it stubbornly. I think it's worked for much of this year, but at times I think it was stupid. We charted at one point in the Ole Miss game where Alabama struggled, came back in the second half, that the Ole Miss game didn't really show that Alabama wore out Ole Miss in the first half and ran it better in the second half. In fact, the running backs were very consistent. We charted it through. The running backs had almost the same per carry averages in the second half that they had in the first half. The difference is they just ran the ball more, and it made them more effective. And maybe they're wearing them out with side to side stuff and jet sweeps and whatnot. There's probably some truth to it, but it isn't actually showing up statistically as much as you'd think. And what happens is Alabama tries to throw the ball at the beginning. Jalen Hurts is still learning as a passer. He's a true freshman. He doesn't completely understand the routes and the offense in general. So, they stall, they have misfires. I think Hurts is very mature in the way he handles the team and the way he bounces back from things, but I think it's a mistake for people to think he doesn't get nervous. He doesn't show it, but I think he does have nerves. And in road environments, I think he does get a little spooked it takes him a little time to settle down. And so if they come out throwing, given how opportunistic Washington's defense is, which they are, they can turn the ball over a few times. And Washington, they throw the ball. They've thrown about twice as many touchdowns as they've run for. And that's a little bit unusual. It's not a very balanced offense in that sense, in a scoring sense, but it means they are explosive, if nothing else. So if you turn the ball over and give them a lot of shots in the first half, I think they're more than capable of putting up some quick points. And that's going to create a lot of problems for Alabama if they're down a 14-foot Hoyle. Now, I think they can certainly come back from it, but I don't think it's out of reason to say that if Alabama comes out slow and throws interceptions, they can be in a pretty big hole pretty fast because their defense is going to be on the field. It's going to be a little bit of a different style of offense than they're used to. I think they're probably going to most teams hold up a little better in pass pro to begin the game than they do to end it. And so they're gonna come out firing. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Chris Peterson. He has good game plans. You can beat Alabama if you script it, and every team has been able to do that. Even UT Chattanooga scored early in the game with a lot of scripted plays. So did Florida. I expect nothing less from Washington. So a slow start from Alabama could make this an interesting game early. Then Alabama has to claw back late. And on top of that, I think it's definitely worth noting that Washington won their games in a pretty handily fashion, right? A handily fashion, but a handy fashion. I mean, they won their games by significant margins. They've been able to put up a ton of points in every ball game, and they get dinged a lot for their schedule, but you can't forget they came out to explosive starts in every ball game. They did everything that was asked of them. And if you think that they're just going to roll over because they have a weak schedule, that's stupid. They may have a weak schedule, but they dominated against that weak schedule, and you have to take that into account.
Yeah, and I think this is something that you and I have talked about all year, and this is something I've complained about for years, is that I can't stand when teams with clean records who struggle against a bunch of crappy teams get elevated to national championship conversation. 2012 Notre Dame is the example I always use. Washington is the inverse of that. I mean, they have played, and I think the bowl season will bear this out. And I don't care what anyone says. Washington has played a pretty crappy schedule. They've played a lot of crappy teams, and I know for whatever reason, some people think that Pac-12 is good this year. We've done countless breakdowns of why that's not the case. A lot of it has to do with circling the wagons in conference. Anyway, Washington's played a lot of crappy teams, and they've beaten the ever-loving crap out of them. And to consistently do that week in, week out, it's very reminiscent, like you said before, of 2014 Ohio State, who we didn't really know what to make of them because of the fact that they didn't play their first-ranked team till like the third week of November. We didn't know what to make of them, so it's hard to model against them, and it's hard to have a certain level of expectation for them. But looking back, they destroyed everybody they played for the most part. Washington has done the same thing. They stubbed their toe against Southern Cal, and they had a close one against Utah. Otherwise, it's boat race city. So for that, they deserve to be not only commended but respected by Alabama fans, SEC fans, because it's really hard to do. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get in the model. I think now's as good a time as any. I mean, we can drift in a little bit into more detail for Alabama, but let's see what the model says. Why don't you run away with it?
The model for this one isn't surprising in what plays into it, but I think it's closer than a lot of people expect, and it comes back to the fact that, like we said earlier, Washington is an extremely good team. For those that are unfamiliar with the model, what we do is we look at things in a per play sense. We don't look at total yardage, total defense. That's too dependent on tempo. It's too dependent on how many plays you get, how many plays your opponent gets, how quickly your game ends. And I don't think that really gives a fair shake, because if you happen to play in a league where you play a lot of snaps, your offense looks good and your defense looks terrible. So we look at per play averages, and we sort of suppose two things. One, the most important thing when you're looking at defenses and offenses is how they fare relative to what the opponent usually does. So, how many yards does your defense allow as a percentage of the yards that your opponents average? So, obviously, the stronger your opponents, the more that giving up a lot of yards matters. It doesn't matter. And the second thing is we sort of suppose that there is some correlation between the amount of points you score and the yard per play you gain. So we sort of plot, if you will, the point total compared to yards per play generated by your offense, and we use that as a way to generate an expected point total based off everything else we're doing. So basically, we're saying, okay, how much of an opponent average do you allow? What is your current average? How much of an opponent average do they allow? What's their current averages? So what's your expected yardage from that? And then taking that and looking at pass production in a per play sense, what is your expected offensive scoring output? Putting all that together, I think it's fair to step back and say usually anything under 80% of opponent averages allowed is elite. 80 to 85 is very good. 85 to 90 is good. 90 to 100 is average, and it seems like having less than 100% shouldn't be average, but you have cupcakes that do pad your stats. Anything above 100% is bad. Alabama is at 40% of opponent rush averages allowed. That's an absurd number. It's a number that's almost incomprehensible, because it's hard to stop someone from getting 3 yards a carry just because they fall forward. I mean, they just have to get to the hole. Thing is, Alabama doesn't let you get to the hole half the time, and when they do, you're not going to go anywhere further than the hole. Alabama allows only 2 yards per carry. Washington averages 3.73, but the thing that I think a lot of people don't miss is that Alabama has played some pretty good rush defenses. Alabama's opponents average 5 yards per carry, and they're still only giving up 2. Washington's opponents only average a half a yard less at 4.5. The pass defenses by both teams are very good, and I think something that would surprise a lot of Washington fans, even accounting for the quarterback play within the Southeastern Conference, Washington allows 81% of opponent pass averages. That's what I said, very good. Alabama is still better. They're allowing 78% of opponent passing averages, and that's a number that's gone down over the course of the season. It started about 87% around the Ole Miss and Arkansas games. So the second half of the season, they've been utterly dominant. and they're just not allowing anything. And, in Washington's played some good passing offenses, but they've played a lot of bad ones. Utah is not very good. Cal's not very good. Oregon State is terrible. Stanford is terrible. Arizona is terrible. And that's really helped Washington's numbers, giving up only 5.6 yards per attempt. Actually, Alabama's average opponents are about almost a yard per attempt better than Washington's. And despite it, because of that, Alabama's pass defense is actually a little bit better in terms of percentage of opponents' yard per play allowed. Regardless, what does it come out to if you play that against each other and run it through this model? And I'll note, this model had Ohio State winning in 2014, so the model I think is fairly fair. That it takes into account how badly you beat your opponents, and it has Alabama having 5.6 yards per play, Washington at 4.7 yards per play, and it has Alabama winning 30-24. That is an Alabama win. It is not the sort of dominant Alabama win that I think a lot of Alabama fans might have expected, but I think it's a very solid win and one to be happy with. The problem and the caveat with all this that we'll get to later is there are some serious issues with the way we evaluate conferences relative to each other. But I think that's a fair shake if you want to get an idea where these two teams are at.
What I love about this game and this matchup so much is it gives both conferences and both, I guess, approaches to the game the opportunity to sort of prove out their model, right? So Alabama's going to face what I think is the best quarterback they've seen all year. Maybe you can give an argument for Chad Kelly. At least the most accurate quarterback they've seen all year, with the best wide receiver duo they've seen all year, with the best running back tandem they've seen all year. Don't sleep on Coleman, y'all. Everybody.
Yeah, everybody looks at Miles Gaskin, but they don't look at Coleman, right? Yeah, Coleman averaging 7.8 yards per carry, pretty darn impressive. I mean, Gaskin's good, but Coleman has been an absolutely devastating player for them with over 100 carries.
Right, and that's what I don't think people realize how good Coleman is. I actually put him in the highlight video for a reason. And if, by the way, if y'all are still listening this far in, check out the hype video. It's pretty good. We give equal airtime to both teams. Shameless plug. So it's really a test of who wins the football games. Does the line play win the football games, or does the skill play win the football games? And I think the answer is yes for both. But when one that does it elite with a line play and one that does it elite with a skill play matches up against one another, we'll see just how important that trench warfare is, because I do think as a collection, this is the best collection of skill players Alabama's faced all year long. So I'm not surprised, especially given the thing we talked about with the slow start, fast start deal. I'll let you get a little bit into matchups. I want to put my score prediction out there. I think 36-24 Alabama, and I think they get down early. And that's not a slight to Washington at all. That's not a cover. I think 36-24 with a late score, because of the reasons I listed. I'm interested, before you give me your gut score, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the model in terms of, we know how it came to that conclusion, but is that what you expected going into it, or were you a little bit surprised?
It really was, because I knew that Washington had been dominant. They've been scoring 40, 50 points a game. Looking back at the statistics, I'm going to put this data together. And, Washington had really done everything you could possibly ask of a football team. But I was a little surprised that it was this close, because Alabama's been utterly dominant. And these statistical models we ran, I think it had Alabama something like a 17-point favorite over Tennessee in that game. Tennessee was very highly ranked at the time. And both of us said that we thought it was probably going to be even worse than a 17, 20-point win, which it did end up being worse. And we got a lot of flack on that in comments. And, we've been very pro Alabama in terms of being a good team. But, Alabama's won all but 2 games this year by at least 3 touchdowns. So there's good justification for our opinion. We're not, I don't think by any means anybody's going to confuse us with being all sunshine and rainbows. So the fact that Washington is this close is a serious testament to Washington as a football team. The one problem with all this is the conference issue, right? How close are these two teams uh, relative to their competition? We know that Alabama is better against the teams they played than Washington was against the teams they played. That's why Alabama is favored. But the model has some issues with connectiveness in terms of one conference versus the other. It can't really tell with one conference is a lot better than the other conference because the teams they didn't really play each other this year. With the conferences, a lot of them like the Pac-12 move into 9 conference games. You don't have many out of conference games. No computer model can really account for this fact because they aren't related. It's like a 4A school playing a 5A school. We know the 4A school, let's say Washington, has won all their games by 30 points. We know the 5A school won some games by the skin of their teeth. What does it mean when the two play each other? It's hard to say. It because the computer just sees them in isolation and it sees how much better Washington is, the teams they've played, and it pretty much just assumes the Pac-12 and the SEC are even. So one of the things I messed around with out of curiosity is I gave the SEC a yard per play bump and I gave the Pac-12 a yard per play bump. If you give the SEC a yard per play bump, and the score changes to Alabama 37, Washington 19. If you do the opposite, it moves to Alabama 25, Washington 30. So currently it has a narrow Bama win, one score Bama win. If you give the Pac-12 an edge, it gives the Pac-12 a 30-25 win. But if you give the SEC an edge, it suddenly becomes a 2-score game. I think personally that I really do think that the SEC probably is better than the Pac-12, frankly. And I don't mean that in terms of people are going to talk about how many more ranked teams there are or whatnot. I'm talking about if you took all the teams together and you made an average team, right? The cumulative average. And I think the cumulative average in the SEC is better, and that's notable because I'm talking about it in how it affects a pure statistic sense of the way the models work. And in this case, that kind of hides, I think, where Alabama is in terms of pure dominance. And I think you end up with something like a 34-17 Alabama game if I were to hedge my bets a little bit, my actual prediction. So I think it's more than the model is thinking. This is going to be a running theme throughout the whole bowl season because I don't think the model is ever going to give the SEC enough credit. The SEC just beat itself up too much, and the model can't really account for the difference in conference quality. But if you were to give my sort of gut instinct, it's probably 34-17. With that said, I'll give one final caveat, and that's Washington is good enough to win this game, and a lot of people aren't giving them that credit. And for all the problems, the offensive line or size or what have you, they're explosive in the passing game. And if Alabama turns the ball over fast early, like we said they could, if they try to lean on the pass game early, which I think would be a huge mistake, they could give Washington some possessions, and this game could have been being closer than they think. I think it's 34-17 because I think Alabama's size is going to wear down Washington in the second half. Washington hasn't had to play that type of football game all season. And I think this is something like a 17-14 ball game at halftime that runs away and becomes, a backdoor cover. But I think Washington is certainly going to be in this. And if Alabama gives up a lot of cheap points early, I definitely think Washington can win.
I think what you said at the end is very, very pointed because I think 17 is low mainly because I do feel like Peterson is a good bowl game prep. I'm not big on the trick play thing. Alabama has a tendency to blow up trick plays like really badly, and he's going to see that on tape. The one thing we didn't talk about that I think is going to be a challenge for Washington is they rely a lot on sideline space plays, especially with their pulling guards and tackles sometimes too. And that's the kind of stuff that really just doesn't do well against Alabama. Not only doesn't do well, it does really poorly. They're just so good in space. So I think they're going to see either they're going to see that on film, and and adjust accordingly, or they're going to realize that that's the core of their offense, and they can't install a new offense in a month. But I do think they have enough talent to be effective, especially early. So I could see like a 17-10 type halftime score and another score given up. But Alabama really put it on in the second half. I think the second half this year has just been so dominant for Alabama. I don't see that changing for this game. All right, so that's Washington, Alabama. I don't think there's a whole lot uh, left to cover there. I know that some Washington fans are going to be a little salty in the comments, probably because of our score. But look, we respect your team probably more than any two people in the SEC. We're being honest about what we see in the data and what kind of score we think will come out of it. But we both, again, have been super high on Washington all year long, and thought early on that it'd be a pretty bad draw for Alabama. I think that given a month to prepare, Washington can probably draw up a little bit, but Saban's pretty good with a month to prepare too.